activist, but what do you say to your critics?
Again, you're being an activist. I am
not. That's not appropriate, sir.
Who are you with? What's your name?
That's not an appropriate question for you to ask.
You're going to ask how many questions? You get 3?
What a stupid son of a bitch.
Good morning, Liberty lovers, Liberty curious, and anyone else tuning in to Friendly Fire. If you're watching live, then let me especially thank you for tuning in so early. This show is dedicated to interviewing libertarian candidates running for office and only libertarian candidates. As the name suggests, candidates will be asked some tough questions, but as a fellow libertarian, I'm not here to make them look foolish or fail. I'm simply raising the bar for how we interview our candidates as well as the expectation for candidates. The Libertarian Party is the third largest political party in the United States and the only viable option to compete with the big two. In this episode, I bring on Marc Victor, who is the Libertarian candidate for U.S. Senate for Arizona. You might recall I had some sharp words for him after his debate a few weeks ago. But then I saw a follow-up video from him to his critics in general, which convinced me to change my position. We ended up getting connected and were able to record a show together. We had more of a conversation than a typical question-answer style episode. Let's get into that conversation. We first came across each other in an unfortunate way, and I think there was misunderstanding on my part. So for people that are watching, let me explain what happened here. So you had a debate, and in that debate, you were asked if Biden was the legitimate president, and then you answered. And then you were then you kind of went into the side point about how, hey, you know what, everything is up for a vote these days, and it shouldn't be. And you started giving some examples. And one of the examples that you mentioned, you said 3 words that like got everybody, including myself, shrieking a little bit. You said age of consent. All right. And then at the time, there wasn't any elaboration. Obviously, we've all seen the debates. There's not a lot of elaboration to be had. And so people were freaking out. I did as well. And a lot of us had some very harsh things to say about you because I do not like the idea of saying anything that you won't say to someone's face. I will let you know what I mean, you heard most of what I said in my podcast, where I think you saw my follow-up to your follow-up, which we'll get to. So I made this comparison, and I said, you know, this sounds to me very similar to Todd Akin when he was in 2012, and I think he was running for Senate as well. He's a Republican. And he said something really bizarre, that when a woman is raped, the body shuts down and she can't get pregnant. And so I likened it to that. Looking back, that was probably not the best analogy, to be honest with you, but I did. And then I said, hey man, this guy needs to drop out. And then I left it at that. And then my friend, he did something really crazy, because him and I have these conversations in the background all the time. He kind of hit me up and he said, hey man, you're wrong. You need to go check out Mark's response to everybody freaking out. And I'm not interested in discussing it with you. And I was like, what? And I was like, my buddy doesn't talk to me like that, right? Like we have discussions, and he'll disagree with me, but he has never said, I am not discussing this with you. And I was like, okay, now you got me curious. I got to go see this guy. And so I went and saw your rebuttal, or not your rebuttal, but your response. And I was amazed. Honestly, I really was. I was like, oh, it was not at all what I was expecting. And I don't know how familiar you are, but when we hear age of consent, a lot of us tend to think of like people talking about lowering the age of consent in some weird, bizarre, philosophical kind of conversation, which never sounds good ever. And so that's kind of where I thought you were going without having any knowledge. So I jumped the gun. I sure did. And but then I heard your response, and I think the favorite part about it was you said there is a range of ideas for which we can have honest disagreement on. But then you said something I've never heard. You said, outside of that range, there are ideas where we cannot have you cannot be a reasonable person and disagree on. So 16, 17, 18, having age consent there, particularly with the matter of sex. Hey, that's a discussion we can have. That's reasonable. People can disagree. But then you said 10, 25, those aren't reasonable ages to even discuss. And that's what really got me. that's what I can. And honestly, I'll be honest with you, Mark. I went into it thinking, okay, he's just going to come up with some cockamania idea about age of consent. And then I was completely wrong. So did I get the story right?
Well, most of your story I wasn't involved in, but the stuff that you said, I think was about me was accurate. But let me say my side of the story.
Absolutely.
Here. I am so impressed with people who can change their opinions. That's what impressed me. That's why I wanted to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just tell you, just from my point of view, I don't get mired in libertarian politics. And I had no idea that, somebody, and I think there was a libertarian who had some wacky ideas about age of consent and might have said some crazy things that caused lots of problems for the libertarians. I knew nothing of this. Had I known about that, I probably would have said something very different, but I didn't know about that. But let me tell you why I brought up age of consent. I've been a libertarian a long time, 30 years, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And look, libertarianism is about changing the law, right? It's about interacting with the government. What is the government? The government is in three branches, right? Making the law, enforcing the law, interpreting the law. It's all about the law. We got lots of economists and lots of philosophers, not enough lawyers, because lawyers, that's what we do. We talk about the law. And I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I've been in the weeds of this stuff as what you might call a very hardcore, very principled libertarian for 30 years. And part of the reason I am doing Live and Let Live is because I really, I've been scratching my head, like I think most libertarians, saying we got the best philosophy. Obviously, what we're saying makes sense. Obviously, it raises standards of living. Why on earth are we in the minority? It makes no sense.
Right.
And the answer is because people don't know what the heck we're saying. And the reason they don't know what the heck we're saying is because we're so bad at saying it.
Yes.
And so I started Live and Let Live to say it better. Okay. And one of the things that we libertarians fight about is how do we implement this stuff? Okay, now we all agree on the non-aggression principle. Don't be an aggressor. We know what aggression is. But how do we implement this stuff? We also argue about how do we transition from here to there. And I've done a lot of thinking in both of those areas. And the truth is there are some very hard questions for libertarians in abortion, which is really what got this whole discussion going. Because if you watch the debate, we were just talking about abortion.
Right.
And the reason abortion is hard, you really got to understand why abortion is hard for libertarians. That's why we had, I don't know if we still have, a substantial group, Libertarians for Life, right? The question isn't when does life begin? Okay, that's a science question. Life begins at conception. We know we got something growing, it's alive. But the question, to put it in libertarian terms, is when does the unborn baby own itself? Or said another way, when does the non-aggression principle protect the unborn baby? Well, there's no right answer here. Some libertarians say, look, right at the moment of conception, that's where the baby owns itself. Other people say, no, that's ridiculous for a whole host of reasons. And then they pick other spots, 15 weeks, viability, or some other time. And so my point here is reasonable minds. And when I say reasonable minds, what I mean is reasonable minds who understand the non-aggression principle, agree with it, and who are trying in good faith to really get it right on this issue. That's really what I mean by reasonable minds. They don't agree on the question of abortion. And therefore, the way I want to resolve this, like I got one of my good friends, Professor Walter Block, who you might be familiar with. Walter calls these types of problems continuum problems. He says, look, there's no right answer. It's a continuum problem, and he moves on. And this is great for Walter, who sits in an academic university. And I say, Walter, look, I'm a criminal defense lawyer on the ground. We still got to figure out what the rule is. We got to do something. Does the person violate the non-aggression principle by having an abortion or not? Like, we got to figure, we can't just say it's a continuum problem and leave it. So where I've gone is, okay, if we stumble on one of these questions, the best way to resolve it is put it in the smallest jurisdiction possible. If it's a really hard question, it should go to the city and town level. If it's not that hard, okay, maybe the state level. Abortion is one of those really hard questions. And that's why I favor putting it in the city and town level. Now, that doesn't really end the analysis, because as you and I know, economics takes over at this point.
Sure.
People can boycott, people can move. It's a low transaction cost. We're not going to get a whole bunch of different rules. We're going to get a few different rules, and the market forces will pick the best ones, and we get past it. So during the debate, when this came up, what I should have said and really wanted to say was this other aspect, and I'll say this because I know libertarians listen to your show, this aspect of the non-aggression principle, where you become an aggressor, you violate the non-aggression principle by putting another person at a substantial risk of harm. That's how we lawyers say it. Non-lawyers might say you can't put another person in danger. That's why you can't fire a gun recklessly up into the air. You don't have to wait till you hit somebody. You're violating the non-aggression principle. When you're driving drunk down the street and you're on the wrong side of the road, we don't say as libertarians, we got to wait till you crash into somebody. This is the very reason we allow self-defense. You don't have to wait till somebody's fist hits your face when they're creating a substantial and what I would now call imminent risk of hitting someone. Now you can hit them first. No problem. So what's a substantial risk? I don't know. You don't know. Different people disagree. That's the kind of question as well that should be in the lower towns and cities to make that decision. Okay, well, so age of consent. This really is, by the way, the best example coming off of abortion. Why? Because the age of consent is the question of not just when does it apply the non-aggression principle to some extent, when are you a full owner of yourself? That's what age of consent means. You get to, it's not just a matter of sex, it's a matter of everything. It's for the euthanasia question. It's when you can take drugs. It's when you can enter into contracts, when you can buy alcohol. It's when you own yourself fully. You don't have a guardian. So it's actually the same exact problem a little further down the line. And of course, it's a debate. So I don't get a lot of time to explain what the hell I'm talking about. So I threw it out there really fast without a thought that this would be controversial at all, because we already have different ages of consent all over the United States. In fact, most states, and for sex, and again, that's one thing, but for sex, it's 16 in most states. It's 18 in Arizona. There's no right answer here. So my libertarian point, which I stand behind, is that reasonable minds can disagree, and we should put it in the local community. But as you said, and just so we're clear here, reasonable minds disagree within a certain range on all of these questions, right? All of them have. What's a substantial risk on guns? Well, Chuck Schumer is going to say, if you have a .22 handgun locked in your safe in your house with the ammunition outside of it, well, that's still a substantial risk, because shit, you could wake up in the middle of the night, put it together, and have an accident. Okay, sorry, that's not a reasonable risk of harm. Also, on the other end, you might be experimenting with deadly viruses downstairs in your basement and letting your 8-year-old child keep an eye on it when you go to work. Okay, that's clearly a substantial risk. There's no argument that that's not a substantial risk. But there are areas in there where reasonable minds disagree. Those are the questions, right? So it's within the range. Step one, what is the reasonable range where reasonable minds can actually disagree? And step two, select one of those choices in the lower community. And then really step three, let's see what the market does with it. That's how we'll get past these hard, what Walter Block calls continuum problems. Okay, so Dave Smith really got this thing cranked up. And I sent an email to Dave, who I like, by the way. I don't know him very well. I met him once or twice. And I said, basically, look, Dave, I wish you had just reached out and talked to me and say, hey, Mark, what the heck were you talking about? What did you mean here? I would have appreciated that, because, again, I'm not mired in libertarian politics. I'm not a politician. I have no idea that this is even going to be controversial. But I cut that video just to make it clear. And, you know, I also said we libertarians are going to face the questions about legalization of methamphetamine, and all taxes are theft. And the proper amount of taxation is zero. Like, we have much harder questions. If we can't stand behind the age of a reasonable difference on age of consent should be decided. We're not worth being libertarians. We're libertarian wimps, and we don't need to be libertarian. We should be boldly promoting the non-aggression principle, which, by the way, I now call the live and let live legal principle. Means exactly the same thing, but as you know, I'm pushing the Live and Let Live global peace movement. And I've added to that a moral principle that we describe with the be a good human, which is completely voluntary, right? You have every right to be a jerk as long as you don't violate the legal principle and aggress. But we're trying to inspire people to not be a jerk, actually be a good human. Why? Because we need that to get to peace. We don't need it to get to freedom. If you stop aggressing, we got freedom. But as you know, you could still be a jerk and we could be living in freedom. We're pushing, we're going a little further with the peace movement. We're trying to get to peace. So we're pushing be a good human, but also that this is necessary, in my opinion, to improve our message.
Yes.
Because people, they say, oh, you libertarians, you want to cut off welfare. You don't care about poor people. Or you libertarians, you want to let those white racists ban Jews and blacks and whoever else from doing business in their stores if they choose. And we say, yes, but then we pivot to an economic argument. And people are left with this, they're not very happy. We say the same thing with the Live and Let Live crowd, but we go further and we say, look, that guy, while we defend his right to not do business with whoever he wants for whatever reason, he's not part of our crowd. We're pushing, inclusiveness and voluntary kindness and open-mindedness and tolerance and these kinds of things. And that's a much more palatable answer for people. And we got to get them to understand the difference between a legal rule and a moral rule. As you know, when people can say stuff like, well, I think prostitution is moral or immoral, but I think it should be legal nonetheless. When they say that, then we say, they get it. And what better way to explain it to have two separate principles out there now, the legal principle and the moral principle. So I think Live and Let Live is a much more improved version of our message. But I got to say, very disappointed that so many libertarians, my brothers and sisters, libertarians, without even bothering to call me up or shoot me an email or something, went off the deep end, said all kinds of terrible things. This guy, D.L. Cummings, he changed his mind and reached out and said, hey, Mark, I was wrong. I'm changing my mind. You didn't completely change your opinion for whatever reason. That's fine. But you acknowledged it and you moved forward. I haven't heard from Dave Smith. I've sent him countless emails. In fairness, by the way, Dave also said that he didn't like my comment about Mattis, General Mattis during the debate. And the reason he didn't like that is because he felt that General Mattis didn't want to pull troops out of Syria, and Trump did. Okay, I agree with Dave on that point. But there were many other things about Mattis that I liked, namely that he opposed Trump putting the military on the streets to deal with civilians after the George Floyd thing. He understood the dangers of putting the military out there on the streets, and I liked that a lot. But none of that had anything to do with why I brought up Mattis. And I explained to Dave, the reason I brought it up was simply because Blake Masters, my Republican opponent, basically broad-brushed all generals in the military as being pro-wokeism and a bunch of incompetent boobs. And I was just rebutting that simple point. I wasn't promoting Mattis as a libertarian or something.
Right. I don't want to try to speak for anybody in particular. Dave Smith, if he wants to, he can reach out to you and you guys can maybe have that conversation. I like Dave. Him and I don't communicate on a regular basis, so I can't really speak for him. I can't even speculate, where he's going. But what I can say, at least for the larger libertarian population, we do have a tendency to jump the gun, myself included, right? Like I did too. I could have waited a couple of days. And then maybe the uproar of what you had said would have motivated you still to put out that video. And then I would have seen it before I had ever said a word. Right. So, when you did it like a couple of days after, it wasn't like we had to wait 3 weeks for it.
Yeah.
Justin Amash spoke at Reno, and part of his message was we're too quick to jump on each other. And he's right. We are. On the other hand, I do kind of understand the sensitivity, at least in this particular case. I don't think that it necessarily absolves it, but I at least can understand the sensitivity, because one of the things that we're going through right now and as a society is we're having like these crazy debates about things like drag queen shows for kids, which I think is extremely inappropriate. like maybe you could make maybe I'm saying maybe everybody, maybe you can make the argument that drag queen story hour, when it's not too sexual looking, isn't so bad at the local library. But there's been an awful lot of videos out there that have way exceeded that, right? And so I think right now, when you combine the past of of thinking of age of consent as a very highly sexualized but possibly inappropriate conversation to have, and then you add in where we are currently as a society, and then to your point, we got a long way to go to really learn how to deliver the message. So and that's one of the things that I tried, and I'm gonna kind of out myself a little bit. Years ago, I said, you know what, this message is, we got to work on this. You guys need to learn how to deliver the message better. You got a great message, but man, you're messing it up. And I said, someone's going to show you guys how to do this. And I said, it's going to be me as soon as I go learn how to do it myself. And so I literally joined Toastmasters so I could learn to take a message and deliver it. And I've even, I'm just continually learning, and I'm like, all right, what can I do better? What can I learn from this person or that person? And one of the things that I recently learned to do is, I feel like you've got kind of two major sides, if you will, right now. I know you may not be following the Libertarian Party, but we kind of got two major sides that are kind of fighting each other. And I feel like one side is really good when the message is delivered in a way that they like it. And another side is really good at when the message is delivered in the way that they like it. But neither side seems really good at dealing with the message when the other side delivers it. It's like they completely break down, and then they would rather piss and moan than say, you know what, how can I grab the bull by the horns and steer this around to a place where I can work with it? And so I've been trying to do that and say, all right, I don't really like this message, but let me see how I can figure this out. You did it for me, actually, when you made your response. And I tried it out. Actually, I told I have a buddy of mine I'm always hanging out with. And I told him, I said, all right, here's what was said. Here's why people freaked out. Here's what he said in response. And I said, sound reasonable to you? And he was like, yeah, sounds like it, totally reasonable. He's like, I get it. Makes sense. And he's not on board with libertarian ideas, right?
He should be. And we need to get him on board.
I am working. So the foreign policy is the foreign policy is his big hang up. Really big hang up.
Dia, let me invite you to do something.
Okay, I'm going to try.
I'm going to invite you to do something. If you want to know what's wrong with the libertarian message and how we intend to fix it, there's a speech I gave. It's on my website. It's on the liveandletliverevolution.com website. It's the one I gave in Vancouver. That speech was at the Capitalism and Morality Conference. This was seasoned libertarian. In fact, I spoke right after Walter Block, and I laid out what's wrong with the libertarian message and how we're improving it and why we're improving it. So that's one thing. If you want to see it delivered in a way that, while not perfect, I think it would be much more palatable. And this is what I'd ask you to show your friend. On my website is the 30,000-foot overview of the Live and Let Live movement. That video right there is really calculated to show that one to your friend. And then ask your friend, say, did this guy, don't say it's a libertarian message, forget all that stuff. Just say, listen to this guy. He's putting a peace movement together. It's called Live and Let Live. You like the phrase? We already know he likes the phrase Live and Let Live. And then if he likes that, on my website, there's a whole section about foreign policy on there. I don't think it's right for us to say we're non-interventionists. That made a lot of sense when George Washington said it in his farewell address, because what was going on in other parts of the world couldn't possibly create a substantial risk to us. We shouldn't have gotten involved in any of that stuff. However, there are times when things going on in other parts of the world can affect us, and we can't just bury our heads in the sand. On the other hand, we're not the world's police, and we need to be very clear about that. My position, I just put a video on there on my website that deals with Russia and Ukraine, and another video about China. Show your buddy those two short videos and see what he says, because I think that I've charted a course with Live and Let Live that is going, and I know this because I am getting people who are not libertarians from both the right and the left to join our movement, not the radical right, not the MAGA crowd, and not the radical left, the woke crowd. We're not going to get either one of those. But the people left in the middle, the kind that liked Ronald Reagan or John F. Kennedy, that group, what I call the reasonable group. And we're going to get all reasonable people because that's all we're pushing. The legal principle just says don't be an aggressor. To disagree with that is to promote aggression. And to promote aggression is not to be reasonable. Reason is a conversation, not hitting people over the head. So by definition, if you're reasonable, you agree with us. And we're only at loggerheads if they're unreasonable. But let me tell you some other things I do not argue about. I don't argue about why somebody should not be an aggressor. Is it natural law? Is it religion? Is it social contract? Is it Ayn Rand? Is it I don't care. If they say I'm against aggression, welcome to the club. Let's not fight about that. I don't argue about what the size of government should be. Am I an anarchist? Am I a minarchist? Who cares? All I really need is that you're against aggression, and that same rule applies to all people, all groups, all corporations, and the government. Because if you think that the government doesn't get to aggress, that's all I need from you. I don't need another thing. I don't argue about capitalism or socialism. I don't care which one somebody favors. All I care is that they're against aggression. So if you're a capitalist, if you're for aggression, you might call this crony capitalism. Then I would say that right there is the problem. If you're a socialist and you're for voluntary socialism, no problem with me or you if you're a libertarian. You want to force somebody to join your socialist group? Well, but for that reason and that reason alone, we don't have to talk about economic curves or which is better to raise standards of living or any of those things. You want to be a socialist, have fun. We don't argue about any of this stuff. I think of this like a criminal defense lawyer thinks about convincing a jury. Young lawyers come to me sometimes in our trials. They say, Mark, the cop's lying. Should we cross-examine them? I say, do we need to show the cop's lying? If the answer is no, then why get into the fight? What is it we got to convince them of? I'm going to tell you what we need to convince them of. The live and let live legal principle, the non-aggression principle, if you will. We need them to understand and agree with that. If they take that to heart, that's all we need. We don't need to get into discussions about all of these other things. So the way we deliver the message, I think, is really, really important. And that's what Live and Let Live is about. Now, just a comment on the Mises takeover of the Libertarian Party for a moment. Sure. You might be surprised to hear me say that from what I understand of this, the Mises crowd is correct. And let me tell you what the problem is. And here's what we're finding.
Well, they're correct about what? Or what it specifically mean?
I'm going to get right to it. Libertarianism is, in my opinion, an incomplete message. It doesn't say anything about how you should act other than just don't be an aggressor. You can be a complete jerk. And as long as you're not an aggressor, you are a perfect libertarian. And the Libertarian Party has been drifting unknowingly towards live and let liveism. They've been putting in some nice things about inclusion and open-mindedness and tolerance and these kinds of ethical statements that are not included in libertarianism. And the Mises crowd, who understands this very well, says, let's take those things out of the platform. Well, they look like racists when they do that. They look like bad guys when they do that. But what they're doing is sticking to a very strict libertarian message. You don't have to be an open-minded, tolerant, voluntarily kind, good human to be a libertarian. And so what they're saying is if you're not one of those people, you're still welcome in the Libertarian Party. And the libertarians who understand we want to say something more here don't like that. And this is why you're getting this between what I'll call the traditional libertarians and the Mises group. The Mises group that is paring down libertarian, and I'll make Walter Block happy by saying to really two things. One, a theory of property rights, and two, the non-aggression principle. It doesn't include anything else. It doesn't make us for vaccines or against vaccines. It doesn't make us take the position that corona is deadly or corona is a hoax. This is beyond libertarianism. If you say something on that issue, you are not speaking as a libertarian. The only thing I would say as a libertarian on this stuff is You get to decide whether to take the vaccine or not. You get to decide whether to wear a mask or not. You get to decide whether to close your business or not. You get to decide whether to enter another business, assuming that you're welcome there. That exhausts the libertarian issues on the coronavirus pretty much. Mm-hmm. But live and let liveism adds those things. We add a whole moral principle. So for all those libertarians who want to say something more that libertarianism doesn't reach, I understand why you want to say them. I want to say them too. We're saying it loud and proud, but we're also saying you're free to ignore it, right? You can be a complete jerk. You're left alone under the law. You're not part of our crowd. You're not a live and let liver, but you're free to act that way. But we're trying to inspire people to be good humans. And we do this, as I said, for two different reasons. One, it helps them understand the contours of the non-aggression principle or the live and let live legal principle. And two, we got to say this stuff to fix our world. We should be talking about morality. We should be inspiring people to be better humans. And again, this is beyond libertarianism. I take that. That's why we're calling it live and let live. And I don't feel bad about it.
Gotcha. So let me ask you, are you always this passionate when you speak?
Yes. Look at my speeches from 30 years ago. Talk to any of my friends, and I have many of them that are 25 plus. They will tell you this is the calm version of Marc Victor right here. If you had met me, I was one of those libertarians that was screwing up the libertarian movement. I'll plead guilty. If you had met me 20 years ago, I would have said, DL, are you a libertarian? If you said no, I would have said, well, look, I'm a libertarian. If you had said, what's that? I would have said, I want to legalize meth. I probably would have said, fuck the government. And I would have said taxes are theft, or more accurately, robbery or extortion. And so, you know, as well as I know, when you lead with those kinds of statements, right, people don't listen. They don't listen, right? Right. And that's not really accurate, because I don't really feel fuck the government anymore. What I feel is the government shouldn't aggress. And when the government doesn't aggress, like, for example, putting the tax issue aside for a moment, when the government prosecutes somebody legitimately for murder or for any of the victim crimes, the government is doing something perfectly fine. My only beef here is that they're funding it with taxation, which we could work around. But right, many things the government does are things that we libertarians would want them to do. What we don't want them to do is to aggress. That's the only thing. And of course, they do a lot of that, right? So we should call them out when they aggress, but when they're not aggressing, no problem.
So let me ask you then, and I want to back up here really quickly and just kind of let people know that normally, so what I've been doing is bringing on candidates and talking about their candidacy. I've been taking a little bit of a different approach. Have a conversation around the controversy, but not necessarily go on and on and on about the controversy. I mean, I think you answered it well, so I don't think there's anything to ask you about, like, okay, what about this? What about that? And I think you've mentioned some things that I kind of want to ask you about, like, so for instance, you've mentioned, like, hey, you know what? I don't need to tell people about taxation is theft. I don't need to, give them all these slogans. I don't need to tell them about natural law, all these good things. And I agree. When you say I need them to agree that the government should not aggress, most people don't agree with all of it. It's usually like a yes, but this instance. So how do you feel the progression is for somebody who's coming in and maybe they agree with, like, this much when it really should be a whole lot? They start small, because I think that's where people start. How do they get to the next level, and then the next one and the next one? And what's a libertarian's role in that?
Excellent question. And just to clarify, you're right when you say I don't think we should talk about what the foundation is for why somebody reaches the conclusion, don't be an aggressor. But I don't agree with we shouldn't talk about taxation. We shouldn't lead with that.
Right. That's what I meant. I'm sorry.
The other one we don't need to talk about at all, right? For what reasons are you against aggression? We start the analysis at Live and Let Live with, do you agree with aggression or not? Right. We have to explain what aggression is, of course, so they understand. If you're going to ask me about any issue, in fact, in my book, once I've explained everything, and then now I get to issues, I start with the unknown future issue. In fact, it's on my website if you want to look at it. Mm-hmm. And what I tell people is, even if I don't know what the issue is, I always start the same way. Is somebody aggressing? So the place to start the conversation before you talk about any issue is always the principle. I say, look, I'm against aggression. I'm a live and let live guy. Let me explain what that is. I am against aggression. Are you against aggression? If they say, I'm for aggression, well, let's talk about that before we talk about anything else. I want them to swear a blood oath that they are against aggression. If you want to talk to me about an issue, I'm first talking to you about aggression. Because if you don't first say I'm against aggression, then there's no sense of moving to any of these other topics. So assuming I get that agreement, then you want to move to a topic, no problem. The first place I'm always going to go is somebody aggressing. If they are, it should be illegal, period. Then I move to the second question. Is somebody violating rule number 2, the be a good human rule? If they are, well, we still can't do anything to them, but I'm going to try to persuade them to act differently. Hey, man, act consistently with this be a good human thing, and I'll explain why. And I think I have a good argument here, frankly. I think it is in your own personal self-interest to act in certain ways. I think you'll have better relationships with people. You'll live a more successful life. I have very good arguments there. But if at the end of the day you still disagree with me and you say, Mark, I don't care about that good human stuff, okay, I'm going to try to encourage you to be better, but if I can't persuade you, I'm out. And I'm not going to be friends with somebody like that. You want to be my friend, you got to agree with rule number 1 and rule number 2. But you can be left alone even if you disagree with rule number 2. So always for me, and this is how I think I would encourage all libertarians, first, explain what the principle is, get agreement on that principle. If you don't have agreement there's no sense of talking about any other issues. Then the only thing left is they're either going to agree with us on everything or they're going to backtrack on their agreement regarding aggression. And I think that should be the structure of our conversations. And the reason I was bringing the other stuff up is I think it's a mistake to lead with the issues without first explaining the principle. This was my beef with Jo Jorgensen, who I like. I introduced her when she came to Arizona. And then I sat and I listened for an hour and a half, and not once. She had a big crowd because people didn't like the R or the D. So there was a lot of people showing up to see what's the L about. They didn't hear the phrase non-aggression principle even one time. The one thing, maybe 2 if you have to say a theory of property rights, which, by the way, isn't our problem. Most people agree with our theory of property rights. It's the non-aggression principle. That's the one thing that makes a libertarian a libertarian. If we're not talking about that, we're never going to be effective as libertarians, in my opinion.
So you don't have any friends that disagree with you on aggression at some point?
Yeah. If somebody is an aggressor, they're not, I wouldn't even have them to my house.
Because
I never cross paths with a person like this.
Because I feel like, I feel like that is a lot of people, because I liken it to a tree branch, right? You know, somebody else is on this branch, I'm on this branch, and we're talking kind of at cross paths. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why we don't really get anywhere. And we need to back up and find out, okay, where is it? At what point did we stop agreeing? And I have friends like that, you know, who will agree on some areas, maybe very few, but then disagree on a lot others. So I'm just kind of curious, if you don't have any friends that disagree with you, like, how do you know you're being effective?
Well,
because you're not seeing growth out of people, right?
Yeah, many of my friends didn't start out as libertarians. In fact, I don't even use the word libertarian anymore, hardly. Okay. Try this next time. I was in the gym not too long ago, and, I'm on a machine, and another guy's finishing up, and I'm working in, and inevitably politics came up in some way, and he's talking, and here's what I say now. I say, look, man, I'm just a live and let live kind of guy. Inevitably, they're going to say, and 100% of the time they have, yeah, me too. I'm a live and let live kind of guy too.
Right.
And then I'll, as a defense attorney I'll get them to commit to that position. And then I'll say, what do you think it means? There's several places you can go. Where I often go is, there's not much to this phrase. What does live mean? Live your life. You're in charge of your life, right? They'll always agree with that. What does it mean to be in charge of your life? It means you're in charge of your body, right? If you're not in charge of your body, how can you be in charge of your life, your property, your money, your time? You could just say property. This broad sense of property includes everything. I don't really have to say body, property, money, time. It's all property, right?
Right.
I can get agreement on that very, very easily. And then if you agree that's what live means, well, let live. What could let live mean? Let other people do exactly the same thing. I can get that agreement very, very easily from people. Now, as we get into, they don't know what they've just agreed to, right? They've just agreed to a very hardcore, what you might even call an anarcho-capitalist position. Fine. They haven't realized that taxes are out yet. But that's when we get there, we have that conversation with them. Now, they may try to get out of the definition in a fun place that they like to try to get out as well. You've consented to the taxation by living here, so it's not really aggression. That's a legitimate argument to have, I think. Just because I have a disagreement with somebody there, they're not saying I'm aggressing. What they are saying is, I think you've consented to this act, which I don't agree with, right? And it's a good place to argue about, but they're not coming out still and saying, no, I'm going to take your money whether you like it or not. Okay, if somebody was to say that, I don't want to be in the company of somebody who feels they could take my money at any time for any purpose. I wouldn't let some person like that in my house I hope I never cross paths with such a person. But as I've said, then I move on to rule number 2. I mean, look, you have every right to live in the world and nothing against you, but I don't want to be your friend if you find being a good human. Now you might say, Mark, what the hell's a good human? I say, great, I love that question, because in the Live and Let Live movement, we've laid out a whole host of aspirational values, which I don't have to list for you here, but I encourage people to just go to Live and Let Live and check it out and see what we're talking about here. We don't go too far into morality. We're not getting into places where people are definitely going to disagree. We're sticking our big toe into the pond of morality, and they're very basic ideas. If you don't agree with that, which culminates, by the way, with this, why do we care about this stuff? We want to optimize human happiness and well-being and minimize suffering. If you don't agree with that, look, there's too many people out in the world. I don't have enough time to see all the friends I have now. If you don't agree with that, sorry, I'm not really interested in being friends with you. But if you do agree with that, now I'm excited. These are the kinds of people I want to spend my time with. So, yeah, that's sort of my rough test. Doesn't mean I won't have anything to do with you in a business deal or something, but I like people who agree with both rules. But I will tell you, if people understand what it is we're saying, the vast majority of people will actually agree. In fact, I would love to come back on your show and talk to your buddy and see if I can work on him and get him to understand the Live and Let Live.
I mean, it might could happen. I'll have to talk with him. He's been on the show before. We're always talking. We almost always debate. We never agree on foreign policy. Maybe a couple things here and there, but we generally that's where we really diverge quite a bit and very quickly. Then it's kind of a hit or miss on some social or some more domestic
let me make
policies.
2 points here.
Sure.
First, I think you got to watch out for factual disagreements, right? Because there's a lot of places where you got this set of facts, I got that set of facts. What we lawyers do, in fact, I have a very good friend, Alessandro Fusillo. And Alessandro is one of the most popular lawyers right now in Europe. And Alessandro and I personally adopt different facts on some questions. One of them is climate change. He has a set of facts. I got a set of facts. We don't agree. But because we're both lawyers, what I say to him is, Alessandro, imagine the facts are the way I see them. He says, oh, and I completely agree with you, Mark. And he says, imagine the facts are the way I see them. And I say, well, I totally agree with you, Alessandro. All we're having is a factual dispute. We are not having a philosophical question. So I'm fine with that. We still got to figure out the facts, but he and I, we want to see if we've got a philosophical dispute. So that's point 1. Point 2, let me tell you what I would say to Bernie Sanders. I would first approach him and I would say, Brother Bernie. I would approach him as a brother of mine. I'd say, Brother Bernie, you and I agree on almost everything. I heard what you said about wanting to help people less fortunate than us. I totally agree with you here. I think we should help these people. There's lots of people born into unfortunate circumstances. I also heard you say that we should do our best to make sure people have access to health care and to a good education. We're in total agreement here. He would say, well, yeah, you're a progressive, right, Mark? And I would say, no, let me tell you the one place we disagree. You think these are legal issues. I think these are moral issues.
Mhm.
And then I would go from there to make my case. I would say, well, Bernie, well, you and I agree on the morality here. I want morality outside the law. Let me tell you why. There are people who think women should wear headscarves when they go outside. They want that in the law.
Mhm.
What would we say to them? My morality is better than your morality. Mine goes in the law, yours doesn't. Or that's what we're saying now to them, and that's why we get this, right? What I'd prefer to say is, well, maybe this is a very nice moral rule. I don't take a position on that. But all morality should go outside the law, even my morality. But let's get it done, Bernie. Let's work together and let's help poor people. Let's help them live. Let's help them get access to health care. Let's actually do this. I have to mean that when I say it. We want to be voluntarily kind to those less fortunate. But it's not a legal issue. The problem we have with the good progressives, which, by the way, in my opinion, are the vast majority of them. These are people with good hearts who want to accomplish good moral things. What they don't see is that their morality should be outside the law, like everybody's morality. Because if not, now we're in what we have now, an endless one of these forever, where this is what the Republicans and the Democrats are arguing. They both agree that they can aggress against you. They both have ideas about how people should live. And one side is fighting to force their ideas on you, and the other side is fighting to force their ideas on you. What makes us so different is we're saying, look, we don't want to force you to live any particular way at all. The only thing we're saying live however you like, no restrictions, your body, property, money, and time. The one thing is you don't get to infringe on somebody else's right to do exactly the same thing. You live your life however you want. As a live and let liver, I am taking a position about how people should live their lives. Just because you get to live your life, and I'm 100% clear on that, doesn't mean I can't make suggestions. And I got lots of suggestions to make, and I'm happy to make them. That's what rule number 2 is about. But we got to understand the difference between a legal rule and a moral rule. If we could get that across to our progressive friends, we could win them to our side.
Sounds good. It sounds kind of similar. I did a series. There's a 3-part series on what I consider to be like the 3 pillars of libertarianism. And I didn't try to take a philosophical approach. I didn't try to, and in fact, I usually eschew using any kind of jargon as much as I can, just because I feel like it tends to get in the way. And then we spend way more time talking jargon than we do actually talking ideas to people to communicate. Right. So I said, like, look, first it starts with self-ownership. I said, you have to own yourself. Like, that's the root of everything.
Property rights.
Yep. And then after that, and when I would describe it to people, I would kind of say, imagine I grew a garden in my backyard and I had some tomatoes and cucumbers and, some other vegetables. And I said, because I own myself, I own the fruit, literal, I guess the vegetables of my labor, because I was the one that went out there, dug up the yard, pulled all the weeds, watered it, planted, kept the rabbits out, all that good stuff. And so then therefore I can, choose what I want in the same way that I could choose to go and make the garden in the first place or not.
Yeah.
I have the right to take and do whatever I want with the vegetables. I could sell them to Mark for, a nice fee, or I could give them to Mark if I want, because they're mine. Or I could eat them all to myself, or I could just toss them in the trash because I was like, that was fun. Let me toss these away.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether that was a, good idea, very subjective, it's mine to make because it was my body that did it. And that was my labor. And people tend to understand that very well. And then I go into the other 2 points where I say, look, we've got the non-aggression principle, which just means I'm not allowed to aggress against you and you cannot aggress against me. And then the last one is association, freedom of association.
Do we need that?
Well, the reason I put those 3 together is because I feel with those 3, we can pretty much talk about any topic with the average person and bring it back to those. We
don't need the 3rd one.
Really?
Why do we give me an example where we need the 3rd one?
I use it to explain if I want to have somebody on my podcast named Marc Victor, or if I don't. And if Marc Victor wants to come on my podcast or he doesn't.
But isn't simply saying nobody gets to aggress resolve that? It's your podcast. You are where you are. The only way to prevent me from coming on the podcast right now would be if somebody was aggressing. So we don't need the associate. I mean, I believe let's keep it as simple as we saw. Just the reaction to what I said. A lot of people are really simple. I think the message, and again, you could do whatever you like, of course.
Sure.
My position is let's keep, and in fact, I don't even bring up the property rights thing because most people agree with our theory of property. Most people are going to agree that they own their own body. They own, the fruits of their labor, their money. It's the aggression part that creates a problem. Although in my book, I do talk about it because I think it's an important piece, and to be complete, we do need to say you own yourself and have a theory of property. But that's not where we're meeting our opposition. We're getting our opposition, and it's not even on the aggression point. Most people will agree on an individual basis aggression is wrong. Where they miss the point is when the government aggresses. That's why we baby step them. I say, okay, now everybody, this applies to every person, right? Right. And then I start with a very small group. What if me and you and DL, the three of us form a little group and we call it the whatever group? Should we get to aggress? Everybody will look at me. They look at you like you're, why would the three of you, because you formed a little group, get to aggress? Now, once they've agreed to that, it's over, right? They don't realize it yet.
Right.
Because the next place I go is, well, what about a big group? They look at me again. Why would it matter what the size of the group is? Then I go to a corporation, and especially for our lefty friends who don't like corporations already, they say, of course, a corporation should never get to aggress. And then I say, what about the biggest group of all, the government? Almost everybody who I walk slowly down that path will agree that the government doesn't get to aggress. That's where we've been losing the argument on the government aggressing. And so if you just baby step them there, and then, some of them need a little bit more. Where does the government come from? It didn't just spring into existence. We made it. If there's no us, there's no government, right? We delegate rights to it. If we're delegating rights, well, we can't delegate rights we don't have. And if I don't have the right to aggress, I can't delegate it. Even us in a group, we still don't have it. You just agreed. So we can spend a little bit of time there. But I think that we would be more effective if we made the argument as simple as possible. And by the way, when I start saying it applies to everybody, I throw in something else I like to say. I'm sick of this racism stuff. And I'm saying this as a live and let live, not as a libertarian, because as a libertarian, it doesn't apply. I like to say it doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter who you love. It doesn't matter where you were born, what holidays you celebrate, what color your skin is, if you're religious. Don't care. We care about content of character in our movement, not what package you come in. Okay, so most people love this, right? They say, I love it. It's now, look, there's a concept when you're cross-examining somebody in court. You get them answering with you, your name is so-and-so, right? Right. And you were born at such and such a place, right? Right. Okay, and you work at so-and-so such a place, right? Right. You get them in this sort of flow of walking them down. And you also close the doors of the objections, the places to escape. You just agreed with aggression. And also we should define it before we go further, right? Because we don't want the microaggression crowd saying, oh, you insulted me. That's an aggression. Like we have to define what we mean by aggression, right? We should say initiations of force against another person or their property, fraud, coercion, or doing anything that puts another person in danger. If I'm talking to a little more sophisticated crowd, I might say, don't do anything that creates a substantial risk of harm to another person or their property. That's aggression. Do we understand that? By the way, I also think there are less serious ways to aggress. We should fill out our theory here. A breach of a contract is an aggression. That's the reason we can award damages to somebody who has had a contract breached against them. A tort, which is when you accidentally, negligently crash your car into somebody and injure somebody, that violates the rule as well. And also a violation of a fiduciary duty. I know you got kids, DL. If you stop feeding them and stop clothing them, you're violating your fiduciary duty, which means you're violating the principle. And we can do things to you. We can say, shape up, DL. We're going to put another guardian in that spot. You have an obligation to do certain things. You did that when you made a kid. There are other ways you can get such obligations as well. That's the reason the law can take action here. So those are all violations. The first group are the serious ones, think criminal. The second ones are the less serious ones, think civil. That's what aggression is. That's aggression. It's not microaggressions. It's not offensive words. So we got to get agreement there. And then once we get that, let's get people to understand it applies to everybody, all groups, corporations, and the government. If they've agreed to that, then and only then we move to the issues.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to spend some time thinking about my 3 principles there. They've worked well so far, but who knows? You never know. I could
There's nothing wrong with them.
I could tighten them up.
They're not wrong. It's just more than we need to say, in my opinion.
Oh no, absolutely. Hey, I'm always up for learning and getting better, right? Because once upon a time, my argument was much more difficult and much more convoluted. At least that's how it came across. Do you have any final words that you want to say to anybody? Where can they find you? And actually, I want you to answer one question. I think of 2 people. I think of people that they come in like 2 varieties, right? You've got the blowhards like me, and then you have people that are just kind of regular Joes out on the internet, and they're offering their opinions. What could the blowhards and what could the regular Joes do to better support candidates? And then just kind of how people can find you and help you out.
Well, it's a great question. It requires a little bit of a longer answer, but I'm going to shorten it up. I think that if we are going to get what we want, we have got to win hearts and minds. That's the goal. That's the only goal. It's not getting elected to office. If I was elected to office to the United States Senate, you would find that I wouldn't be very effective in the Senate. I'm one vote. I might stop a piece of legislation here or there or help one get through. That's probably going to be a pretty crappy piece of legislation anyway. It lowers taxes a little bit or it stops some increase. That's not how we're going to get what we want. The way we're going to get what we want is by winning enough hearts and minds so we can do what we want to do. Politics is a good forum to make that happen. It's how you heard of me. I got in the debate, right? And so what we should be doing as libertarians is winning hearts and minds. In my opinion, the best way to do that is to join the Live and Let Live global peace movement. And let me, just to be serious about this, we got to change the world. We got it. That's our community now. Our community is not our state. It's not our country. We got to think nukes. Soon it will be easy for anybody to manufacture a nuke who wants one. People are already engineering pandemics. We got artificial intelligence coming. If we don't get together with the other reasonable people around the world, I fear for the continuation of our species. And I'm not overstating the case here. So we need a movement that is global in nature. We need to make the message simple. It needs to be something that the wind is at our back. The phrase live and let live, people already like this phrase. They don't know what the non-aggression principle means. Half of the people think it doesn't include self-defense. I know, I've been talking about this for 30 years. They say, oh, no, I don't like that. I'm for self-defense. Now we got to backtrack and explain what we mean. But live and let live, they've already got the fist in the air. They love it. They say it in different languages already around the world. What I would ask and invite your listeners to do, go to liveandletlive.org, not even my political website. You can go to the site, the political site, liveandletliverevolution.com, but learn about how we are delivering the message. If you think we got something wrong, by all means, contact me. Maybe I did get something wrong, and I'll be happy to do what my new friend D.L. Cummings does, change his position and improve it when you get something. We all say something wrong from time to time. We all do. Let's improve. Let's be humble about that. I make lots of mistakes. If I said something wrong, and I say things wrong all the time, call me on it. Say, Mark, there's a better way to say that. If you convince me, and I'm open to being convinced, I'll improve the message. So let's work on it together. This can't be a discussion group anymore. We have got to win the argument, and we've got to win it globally. We've got 10 countries in Africa right now, in Portugal, and in Poland, and in Canada. We got a global movement going on the right principles. Check that out. Learn about the shaka. That's our new symbol here, right? Lots of people. The guys in Poland said, Mark, we didn't know what the heck this thing was, what it meant. But now it's catching on. I got guys in Africa going like this. If you've been to Hawaii, you're familiar with what the shaka is about. It means the same thing as the non-aggression principle, as live and let live, as teach them the golden rule. There are many different ways to say the same principle, that you're in charge of